Hey everybody, Troy Bayne here. So glad to be able to share this class with you guys. I've learned a lot already and just challenged every week as we dive a little bit deeper into the New Testament and the theology of it. And just this week again, getting to learn a little bit more about these different ethicists that we're analyzing in chapter 12. I landed on John Howard Yoder. His life, his work really drew me in. I think ultimately it came down to his emphasis on Christ, and even more narrow than that, to the cross. It seemed that that was what his most everything hinged on that for him, and I appreciate how he took an overall view of Scripture. There wasn't did not seem that he was picking and choosing in his exegesis of Scripture. He really included an all-encompassing view of the New Testament. Some things that just stood out to me as I studied this was he did not separate social ethics from the political side of life. In fact, you really couldn't do one without the other. If you were a Christian and you were in a community, you were going to be impacted by and underneath the authority of the politics, and therefore submissive to those authorities. Ultimately, though, our submission comes to Christ, and so he really talked about that at all a lot. That there was no separation between the two. I appreciated how he talked about the living it out aspect of our Christian faith when he announced his pretty much his ministry in Nazareth, and he read from the Old Testament. He says he anointed Jesus to preach to the poor, release the captives, give sight to the blind, give liberty to the oppressed, proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. He's not talking just a pie in the sky spiritual reality, but a social event is what Yoder says. And so those who follow Christ, as he puts it, consequently will find rejection and suffering to be their lot. And that's something for us today, for me today, to be challenged by, that if to truly follow Christ means in this life there will be suffering, there will be ultimately a cost, and that cost is culminated at the cross. And so definitely believe in that, agree with that. He went to the moment at the Mount of Olives when Jesus was wrestling there in prayer and saying, if this cup can pass from me, then so be it, but not my will, yours be done. And that was a historical moment where Jesus submitted to really the violence that was going to be put on him at the cross on our account. And the quote here, it says, "The cross is not a detour or a hurdle on the way to the kingdom, nor it is even the way to the kingdom. It is the kingdom come." So on the cross, the kingdom came, and in our life, that is where we meet Christ ultimately. And so I just appreciated how he brought that in, that bearing our cross is what ultimately this is about, not just bearing our cross as in I've got a physical problem or I'm struggling with a relationship, but bearing the cross is ultimately denying self, willing to die. And that's what Christ modeled, and that's what Yoder is pointing out in his ethic. And then, so therefore, in terms of war and violence, his stance was certainly a pacifist mindset across the board. And so if we live in an environment where the politics changes and we must suffer, then so be it, as the church and as Christians, is where Yoder would say. Barth seemed to open the door to that possibility or permission in situations where another country or group of people, a weaker neighbor, finds themselves in an oppressive situation where he uses the example of the United States attacking Iraq, defending Kuwait in 1991, the Gulf War. And so I tend to agree with Barth there more than Yoder from an across-the-board standpoint, because there seems to be situations where we should stand up for the neighbor who's being oppressed. But all in all, I really appreciated Yoder's focus. One of the things he said was that the cross was the culmination. The resurrection manifests what was already accomplished at the cross. And that is Christ, God challenged the powers, the authorities. He went into their territory, and he talks about Colossians 2 there, is what happened in the heavenlies or the spiritual realm when Jesus went on the cross. And so that drew me in, and then walking through that diagnostic checklist that was laid out in chapter 11, Hayes goes through this synthetic, hermeneutical, the pragmatic parts of that to display, the solid nature of Yoder's approach. And again, he challenges us to remain faithful, challenges us as disciples, what it really means to follow Jesus. And that just drew me in. It's a challenge as a local pastor, myself and the call to our people, not to fall into the cultural lapse of it's just okay to be good enough Christianity, or follow some recipe that life's okay and works out for me, instead of, it's not about what we see, it's about what Christ has done. So anyway, thanks. I look forward to hearing your comments.